Hi, everyone, and welcome to the second episode of Amulya's Corner. Today, we're diving into the fascinating, complex world of the information ecosystem with a true pioneer in the field. Our guest, Alicia Wanless, is a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and the director of the Information Environment Project. Alicia is a leading voice in understanding how information flows in society, often drawing parallels between managing the information ecosystem and environmental policy. Her work challenges conventional approaches to disinformation by focusing on the broader dynamics at play, asking the critical questions about the unintended consequences of interventions in this space. Thank you for joining us today, Alicia. It is such a privilege to have you here. Let's start with your journey. What inspired you to focus on the concept of the information ecosystem and its challenges? How did you first get involved in this field?
That's a great question. So I've always been interested in how leaders attempt to influence populations. So way back when I had been major in Russian, I was looking at things like propaganda and language engineering and nationalism and how those might encourage people to go in certain directions. Through a very long and weird career, I kind of got to the point where, after working in strategic communications, I found that there really wasn't a lot of explanation for how the information environment worked. There were lots of big claims, especially from companies selling support for people running strategic communications, that everything they did was going to work or it had this big impact, but there wasn't really a lot of evidence. And there really wasn't much of an explanation for what the information environment was and how we could understand how it was changing. So felt like there were some really big gaps, which then ultimately led me to pursue a PhD at King's College London, trying to develop a theory for explaining it.
Awesome. Thank you so much for sharing. With content moderation policies and decisions impacting how people receive and trust information online, what are some of the biggest challenges we face today? And how do you think these challenges could influence the broader information environment?
So I would set aside the content moderation question for a second, and perhaps I'll be able to come back to it. But I think the biggest problem we face is that we actually don't understand what the information environment is. So it's really difficult to understand how changes, say, in content moderation policies or the introduction of new technologies are changing a system that we didn't really have baselined or formulated an understanding for how it works as a system before that change is introduced. And the way that I've been kind of trying to explain this is looking back at ecology. It's taken, 100 years or more to build up an understanding of complex systems within the physical environment. In the past, in the 60s, there was a burn because bird eggs were thinning. And the hypothesis was that the thinning had occurred just after the introduction of a pesticide known as DDT. But that was just a correlation at that point. And we wouldn't have actually been able to understand that that was perhaps the cause if we didn't have something like historic egg collections that had been built up over decades. And the same goes for other things like what's in water. Having tests for decades and decades tells us that something changes. We actually don't really do that in the information environment at the current point in time. We're not looking over decades and across cultures to really understand different factors that might be changing. So this makes it really challenging to really understand what a change might be because of something that comes into the system. And then what we tend to do is really just study directly that thing. So there might be a lot of work looking at what content moderation policies are there, but it looks just at that and it doesn't necessarily consider other factors like perhaps literacy rates or who the people are who are seeing these things and how that changes their overall access to information, because we don't just get information from social media. We are getting it from a number of different sources, and that's influenced by our backgrounds, the people we talk to, the moods that we might be experiencing, cultural implications, etc.
Thank you. That's a great explanation. And this kind of brings me into my next point a little bit. I wanted to talk to you about generative AI. It has been such a game changer in so many ways, but also comes with a lot of risks, particularly in shaping mis and disinformation. What role do you think AI will play in the future of the information ecosystem? And are there any steps that we should take to safeguard against potential harms?
A really difficult question to answer, in part because, unlike social media in the past, I think the applications of AI and possibly generative AI are so vast and numerous. There is a question of what we're even talking about when we ask that question. If it is a matter of, faked content or altered content that is produced more at scale and then shared somewhere else, there also is this issue of the complexity of the system again, because if it's being shared, what we're seeing is that it is tending to go through existing means. So it happens on things like social media, or it's coming up in search engines, or there is this intent to kind of game those search engines. And we don't really have a great understanding for how each of those component parts, say social media platforms, say search returns, et cetera, are actually working within the broader web, and then also the on and offline environment, which is the information ecosystem and environment surrounding it. And so if we don't even have an understanding of those component parts or how they affect each other, it's really challenging then to get a hold of what the impact of something like that would be. Now, set that aside, there are places in which it's a lot easier to measure the impact of tools like that. So, for example, in a very closed system like a hospital where doctors are using some form of AI to diagnose patients, you could potentially go and study that and then see what kind of impact that's having on diagnosis and patient outcomes a lot more readily than you can say study the impact of generative AI's use and on democracy, which is another complex system which has, many variables that are studied to understand its state.
Got it. Okay. And I saw that in your work that it often emphasizes engaging the next generation in fostering a healthier information ecosystem. Why do you think it's so important for young people to be involved, and how can they make a meaningful impact?
I mean, I would say that it isn't necessarily just a question of a younger generation, although it is their future. And this is going to be wherever they live, the information ecosystem that they inherit. It's the same as the physical environment. I think it's important for them to gain a better understanding for how that system works and how it's manipulated, and how potentially the information they're receiving is actually aimed at manipulating a response in them. So there is a need for far greater critical thinking, but then also understanding things like how do humans calculate risk? How does the information that we're exposed to perhaps shape how we see things? How dependent are we on different types of tools? So we often look at whatever we're looking at, which is like, say, social media off the top, but there's an underlying infrastructure that has been built up that makes that information or that platform available. And so how does that all work behind there? Who's got access to what data? How might what they're putting out there into the world be used against them eventually? And I think it's more a mindfulness kind of approach, right? Becoming more aware of our role inside the information environment and how we shape it or shaped by it, and what risks are posed by the different tools we use and information we access.
That's a really powerful insight because I feel like I approach my information ecosystem very surface level. I never really think about the risks, what I'm really doing on the internet, the content that I'm necessarily putting out. So I guess being more mindful about, what I'm posting and things like that is some really good advice. And then finally, I wanted to ask if you could implement one major change in how we approach disinformation in the ecosystem, what would it be and why?
I think first and foremost, we need to look beyond disinformation. I think that has been a focus of research for quite a while, and that isn't to say that information of low quality, especially that is created deliberately to provoke responses or mislead people, isn't a problem and it isn't dangerous. I just think that by the time it's present within an information ecosystem, it's very difficult to do anything about. So we seem to be treating kind of like a disease after it's come into play without any understanding for why it might have been something that could become such a problem in the first place. Add to that, we're just dealing with basically narratives. So once it's present in an ecosystem, the problem is that there's a certain percentage of people who clearly have believed it, profited from it, pushed it, and now it becomes a political issue. So how do you dig into people's brains and get rid of it? So one is that I would say I think we really need to look past symptoms and try to understand the structure of the system to get to the bottom of why these things become a problem in the first place, and what points of intervention might happen earlier on to create conditions where maybe people are more skeptical of bad information or malinformation or whatever you want to call it, have the skills to actually dig deeper into the content that they're seeing and really understand you know, what information means to them. So I think that's what I would change. If I had a magic wand, it would be let's look past disinformation. Let's look at the underlying system. Let's see if we can find patterns in terms of how people access information, where the vulnerabilities are, and where the opportunities are for creating more resilient societies. Now, all of that said, I think there's this tendency to maybe wish that everybody in the world will agree and share the same opinions. I think that that's really unrealistic. And also, it probably doesn't lead to much growth or innovation. And we are in a time where that is necessary, where we're facing multiple complex crises that threaten our very existence. We do need innovation. So I think the bigger question here is what conditions actually support some level of competition and conflict without tearing the society apart.
That's a great question. And I just want to thank you so much for sharing your time and your insights today with us. It's been an absolute pleasure. I'm an incredible fan of your work, but I think it's really important, but also thought provoking as your work really challenges us to reconsider how we navigate and protect the information ecosystem. So thank you, Alicia.
Thank you.